This video is brought to you by Manscaped.com. Andrew Garfield. He's an award-winning actor, a handsome British man, a massive fan of Spider-Man, and he secured a distant third place, otherwise known as last place, against the likes of Tom Holland and Tobey Maguire on a Twitter poll that asked you guys who your favorite Spider-Man was. Like, it wasn't even close. Last week, I spent about an hour talking to you all about why I loved the Raimi films, and it even managed to last about 50 minutes before getting a copyright claim, so that was fun. Not like it's a time of year where I need to pay for stuff or anything. Patreon.com/totally-not-Mark. Similar to the Raimi trilogy, I hadn't seen the Amazing Spider-Man films since they were in theaters, which means, in the case of the first one, I hadn't seen it in like 10 years. While Raimi's trilogy was full of good memories, my feelings towards these Mark Webb films before reacquainting myself with them spanned from indifference to genuine distaste. Because I was 20 years old when I last saw these films, I felt as though I remembered quite a lot, but boy was I in for a surprise. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the emotional, the intense, the shocking, the amazing Spider-Man.
When life leaves you high and dry, I'll be at your door tonight. If you need help, that you will do the same for me, and I will do it for you.
Having not seen these films since I was in college, I was eager to see if my lukewarm feelings towards them would have changed now that I'm in a completely different part of my life with an entirely different set of expectations. Going into this reboot of Spider-Man, I, like many my age at the time, felt like it needed to live up to or exceed what the Raimi trilogy achieved. And in retrospect, I think that's an entirely unfair expectation to lay at the feet of Mark Webb and this first film, The Amazing Spider-Man. For the most part, nowadays these films aren't remembered too fondly by the majority of Spider-Man fans, and I think I was in the same boat before revisiting them. I was 20 years old then, and now having sat down to watch these once again in my 30s, I gotta be honest, while I can still see some significant issues with these movies on a narrative level and even a fundamental Spider-Man one, I can confidently say that largely I was wrong. And so, while we dive into these films, I'd like us to do so with an open mind. Typically, when it comes to these reviews, I try to give the director and screenplay the benefit of the doubt where I can, trying to best connect with and understand the story they were trying to tell. And the first step in doing so is to try and remember what the ecosystem of Hollywood 2012 looked like. Since the release of The Dark Knight in 2008, 1 year after the last Raimi film, it was clear to see the motivation for Sony to move onto something more in keeping with what they figured the global zeitgeist was begging for, a more realistic approach to the wall crawler. And with that mindset in place, it ushered in with it a new era of superhero flicks that tried to focus in on and capture the qualities that made the Dark Knight trilogy so successful with a younger generation. A gritty, more character-driven and realistic story, which, if this wasn't already apparent, made for an impossible set of circumstances for this film to succeed with in the first place. And what I mean by that is, I can't speak to everyone's impression of the Raimi films, and I won't, but the impression I've received over the years from talking to and asking many people questions about Spider-Man and what that character ought to be, more often than not, it seems like Sam Raimi's films, and indeed more modern interpretations of the character, are seen as the quote definitive version or iteration of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And as such, everything else that's new needs to live up to those expectations, which I can't say I agree with at all. I mean, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker in the first place isn't anything like the original comics interpretation of the character, and I'm not going to knock him for that, because it doesn't need to be, and I thought Sam Raimi's version of the character served his film series well. However, I believe despite it not being his intention to do so, Sam Raimi created for an entire generation of people an image of Spider-Man that they saw as the quote definitive version. And truthfully, looking back on how I felt at the time, this particular line of thinking rings true for how I was feeling back then, but not today. And I think that's the main reason why I left this film very satisfied. So let's dive into it with an open mind and see how my opinions regarding this film have remained the same and how they've significantly changed also. Starting with Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker.
Put him down, Eugene!
Peter Parker. This is probably the most controversial aspect of this series of films, and where I think I too had the most issue when I saw it in college. I touched on this briefly in my Sam Raimi video, but Tobey's incarnation of the character, while loved by many, should not be, but often is, seen as the definitive version of the Peter Parker character. And I feel like it shouldn't be seen as such, primarily because, A, if you're a comic book purist, you'll realize Sam Raimi's version isn't an accurate portrayal of the character and his personality from the original run of the comics, and B, I think as cultures and sensibilities surrounding different characters change, so too must the characters to some degree in order to make sense in and appeal to that generation or world. Going into this film, Mark Webb, off the back of directing 500 Days of Summer, a character-driven comedic drama, was hired to direct a Spider-Man film with those same realistic dramatic sensibilities in order to capture what he was told an audience was clamoring for in his own way. And with all of that taken into consideration, what I'm about to say might sound like a cardinal sin, but I not only think Andrew Garfield is a great Spider-Man, like many do, but I also think he's a good and sometimes great Peter Parker. Tobey Maguire and Sam Raimi's version of Peter Parker comes across like a quiet, meek, but otherwise pleasant fellow, and that serves his stories well. However, when you compare him to the original run of the comics Peter Parker, the differences become much more pronounced. In the comics, Peter is roguish, short-tempered, and resentful at times. His story isn't like Tobey's, where a good guy becomes vengeful and then becomes a good guy again. Instead, the original origin of Peter Parker tells the story of an outsider, one that was able to speak up for himself but never had the power to enact his will unto the world. A bully victim that would be a bully if he had the power, which in effect makes the story of responsibility so powerful in those early comics. Powerful because Peter Parker isn't the sort of person who would naturally adopt responsibility. Remind you of anyone?
Hey, Parker.
Not today, Flash.
Hey, come on, man. I don't just want to talk.
This isn't a recreation of Tobey Maguire's version of Peter Parker. This is someone else, someone that's much closer to what Peter was in the original run of the comics in the 60s. Furthermore, during the director's commentary for the first film, Tobey confessed when questioned by J.K. Simmons about his experience with the character of Spider-Man growing up that he in fact shared no connection with him at all. He wasn't really a fan of the character, and in preparation for the role had to read 100 issues of the original comics run to prepare. This is perfectly fine, of course, however it stands in direct contrast with Andrew Garfield's experience.
No, I don't know about the cool thing. There's an outsider quality that I wanted to achieve, that resilient orphan. That's able to, you know, that has a kind of defensiveness and a difficult to access aspect. So there was that, and you know, there's so much dimension to Peter Parker. I think he finds a confidence when he finds his power, and that may be the cool you're speaking of. That he accesses a kind of a rebelliousness that he hadn't been able to access before.
There are countless interviews from this time period with Garfield showing us all that he's not only intimately aware of what makes Peter Parker tick, but also that he's a massive fan of this character. He sincerely felt a tremendous amount of pressure, not just from the rest of the world, but from himself. He knows what this character means to everyone because it means a lot to him, and whether you prefer Tobey's interpretation of Peter Parker or not, Andrew Garfield's performance, I think, as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man is unrivaled in terms of authenticity. The Tobey films really didn't spend a lot of time on the origin of Spider-Man becoming Spider-Man, with him immediately going into superhero mode once he's faced with Uncle Ben's killer, which is fantastic for that film as that's what the film is about. It's a camp, hokey caricature and romanticized reimagining of both New York City and the story of Peter Parker. The monologues from villains, mentors, and heroes in these films follow more closely with a Shakespearean drama than a realistic interpretation of any character or location. The Amazing Spider-Man, on the other hand, tries to make Peter Parker feel like a real human being. Like the original comics, he's angry, he's roguish, he's ego-driven, he's resentful, he's flirtatious, and most importantly, he's not naturally virtuous. I've heard people complain about this particular aspect of his character, that he's not really a nice guy, that he's kind of an asshole, and that's the point. This is a lesson, a transformation that he's supposed to undergo himself in order to become Spider-Man. Which is perfect, as that's exactly what this film is about and where I think its greatest strengths lie.
This could have gotten a lot worse.
Becoming Spider-Man. Peter Parker is just the foundation of this story, and faithfulness to the comics alone does not make for a good story. Things can be accurate all they like, but if the core story being told is told poorly or doesn't hit the right notes at the right time for the audience, then there's a problem. And while there are problems that exist with this film that I will most definitely be speaking on later, they have absolutely nothing to do with Peter Parker, Spider-Man, or Andrew Garfield's portrayal of either, in my opinion. In fact, there is a 40-minute stretch in this film where I sincerely believe it's almost perfect, telling a very human story of ego and how it can fool you into thinking that you're doing the right thing when in actuality, all you're doing is indulging in a selfish desire.
I just did 80% of your job, huh? That's how you repay me?
The portion of this film that won me over as a Spider-Man fan starts here, when Peter, powers and all, return home to an angry Uncle Ben. Which, by the way, is something to address quickly. Despite the clumsy means with which he's written off to die, I love Martin Sheen's performance here as Uncle Ben. This iteration on the Uncle Ben character feels more fleshed out with a more human quality to him. He's visibly flawed, prone to anger, gets confused, and is openly self-conscious concerning his lack of education, particularly towards his adopted son Peter. But at his core, he's an honest man that deeply cares for his son. And so, in the same way Aunt May's character reminded me of my grandmother in the Raimi trilogy, this Ben Parker reminds me of my grandfather. But I digress. Peter fails to uphold the responsibility that was given to him by Ben to look after his wife May, which leads to a monologue that is often criticized online today. The quote goes, "Your father believed that if you could do good things for other people, then you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here, not choice, responsibility." And to tell you the truth, despite the original Uncle Ben not actually saying "with great power comes great responsibility" line in the comics, this still comes across and hits me like a change that was made purely to differentiate itself from the Raimi films, and I don't know, I don't really like it, but I can take it or leave it, it's not a big deal. Following this heated and ultimately final interaction between these two characters, a similar series of moral mistakes are committed by Peter to create this scene. And this is where the Raimi films and this Webb film differ in the best of ways. You see, instead of immediately learning this lesson following this mistake, he instead tries to right the wrong he feels in his heart. He feels guilty and now motivated to hunt down and take revenge, to restore balance to the world, he thinks. And this is the portion of the film, and indeed this story, most people take issue with. And to be quite honest, I can see why. He comes off as quippy, yes, but there's a real air of ignorant, uncompassionate, and perhaps egotistical heroics, if you can even call it that. He dons the mask not to save people or to do the right thing, but to exact his revenge unto the man who took his uncle from him. And this is the first time we see him in this suit too, further rubbing salt onto the wounds of fans that did not see this as their Spider-Man. But, and this is where I make my feelings known concerning this choice, I think this is the single best decision ever made in a Spider-Man film. One that not only works for this movie, but feels so incredibly faithful to the spirit of this character in ways no other live-action film has managed to achieve for the character of Peter Parker, and indeed Spider-Man, extending and by virtue of it highlighting the qualities that make Spider-Man, Spider-Man. In Tobey's films, the origin of Spider-Man was actually quite short, and that's one of the film's strengths, I think. There's a concerted effort to establish numerous moving parts in the first half hour of that film, and really, by the time the first hour is over, Spider-Man has, in a sense, reached his final form. However, when it comes to Andrew Garfield's amazing Spider-Man run, there's so much more detail and nuance to his development. So much so that the entire first film is about his origin. That's the focus of the film, and in the spirit of that, I'm sure many of you that are familiar might be able to pinpoint the moment Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker finally becomes Spider-Man, on the bridge saving that small child. And while that scene is spectacular and one of my favorites in these films, it's not the best scene in this movie, and it's not where he becomes Spider-Man. Instead, it's here.
It was assaulting civilians in the dead of night.
Is assaulting people? I'm not sure. I mean, I think most people would say that he was providing a public service.
This is the single most important scene, not only in this film, but perhaps in all of Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man films. And I'll explain why. This is the scene where all the story's themes are explored, laid to bear, and most importantly, this is the scene where Spider-Man is born. Peter is extremely combative and defensive on these talking points, defending Spider-Man's actions as helpful and virtuous, while Stacy makes his stance firmly disagreeing with Peter's, and thus an argument ensues. The best scenes in cinema, I think, come from two people in a room talking to each other. Everything else is just set dressing for the audience. And this is a tremendous example of how terrific and powerful a scene can be with just two people exchanging points of view. The argument begins with Peter taking the side of Spider-Man, espousing his virtues, all the while Gwen's father explains why everything Peter is saying is either driven by ego or just wrong.
If I wanted the car thief off the street, he'd already be off the street. The car thief was leading us to the people who run the entire operation.
And that's a big hit for Peter. The look on his face when Stacy talks about strategy and how Spider-Man ruined that opportunity for them says it all. Peter's not stupid, so why didn't he think of this? The police had their own plans which would have yielded a better result for the city at large in the long run, so he should have thought of that, right? Well,
Obviously, he didn't know you had a plan.
for a large portion of this conversation, Peter tries to defer responsibility, deflect fault, and excuse any mistakes Spider-Man might have made. That is, until this scene reaches its brilliant turning point.
I think he stands for what you stand for, sir. Protecting innocent people from bad guys.
I stand for law and order, son. That's what I stand for, okay? I wear a badge. This guy wears a mask like an outlaw. He's hunting down a bunch of criminals that all look the same, like he's got some sort of personal vendetta. But he's not protecting innocent people, Mr. Parker.
This scene encapsulates this entire film and precisely pinpoints the epiphany that transforms Peter from a rogue terrorist to a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Heck, it's this very conversation which drags him onto the roof where he fills Gwen in on his identity and senses danger on the bridge where the lizard is causing havoc. A brilliant example of cause and effect in film. Peter learns the error of his ways, gets excused from dinner, and as a result of being excused, reveals his identity to Gwen and puts himself into the perfect position to save people. What a brilliant scene, and it's by far my favorite in this film. As the icing and cherry on this proverbial cake comes this bridge scene. If the previous dinner scene was the sequence in which Peter became Spider-Man, this is the scene where Peter proves it. Up until now, Peter had been capturing bad guys almost with the laser focus. However, not because he wanted to do right by the citizens of the city he grew up with, but instead to satisfy his own selfish desires for revenge and recognition. It's a fault born out of a lack of adult guidance and naivety. This is on full display in the scene where he takes out the car thief and deals with the police officer that arrives on the scene. He's totally blown away by the fact that the cops want to seize both him and the car thief, and in response leans into this arrogance and narcissism. And it's this very character trait that the original comics utilized to make the themes of responsibility so powerful, transforming a young, troubled, and irresponsible teen into a responsible young adult capable of maximizing the good he's capable of. And this bridge scene demonstrates that perfectly, catching cars as they're about to fall, at first in pursuit of the lizard in order to apprehend him. However, eventually, despite getting the perfect opportunity to chase after a weakened lizard, Peter volunteers his time instead to stay behind and save a young boy in a burning car hanging from the bridge. The scene in question is incredibly endearing and intimate. Andrew Garfield demonstrates once again why he's one of the most underrated actors in Hollywood and delivers one of the most powerful scenes in any Spider-Man film, showing us and indeed Peter that he is capable of instilling so much more strength into others by simply making the right choices. And that's the best part of this film. That stretch from Uncle Ben's confrontation with Peter to this moment on the bridge. It's a stunningly perfect depiction of Spider-Man's origin with a teen that isn't naturally inclined to adopt responsibility. And it's given me chills in ways no other Spider-Man film has managed to do to date. Happy New Year! We're treating 2022 as a fresh start here on the channel, and that means a new me thanks to Manscaped. If you're looking to overhaul yourself too, then the Awesome Performance Package 4.0 has everything you need. The Lawnmower 4.0 is the highlight of this package. This cordless trimmer is not only waterproof and great for sensitive skin thanks to its skin-safe tech, but it also features a fancy LED light that's perfect for getting an eye in on those hard-to-reach areas. And with Valentine's on the horizon, you better make sure those areas smell great. Flowers and chocolate are a great start, but wouldn't she also love you if you treated yourself with the Crop Preserver and Crop Reviver? That's right, this kit comes with handy ball deodorant and ball toner spray to ensure you smell great for Valentine's Day. And hey, if the tickle of your nose hair bothers her in your more intimate moments, the Weed Whacker nose and ear trimmer has you covered too. 360-degree rotary blades and the same skin-safe tech from the trimmer, this thing is wonderful. Every guy needs to add Manscaped to their wish list this Valentine's Day, and if you've got a special man in your life who needs a good cleanup, then make sure you get him this awesome performance package. It even comes with a free travel bag and anti-chafing boxers. It'll look totally innocent and not as though you think he smells. So, don't worry. Go to manscaped.com and use my promo code NOTMARK20 to get 20% off plus free international shipping and 2 free gifts. The Amazing Spider-Man films boast 2 separate suits, one for the first film and one for the second. Everyone loves the second suit, and so do I. It's beautiful, slightly more flamboyant, and overall I think it's a little more iconic looking, if that makes any sense at all. But I think there's a lot of brilliance in the first film and what the suit offers the story in terms of authenticity in the context of the film. For instance, a guiding philosophy in the creation of this first film on behalf of Mark Webb was to breathe a sense of realism into the story, the likes of which we've seldom seen in the past. The Sam Raimi films, as I mentioned, were a melodramatic, almost Shakespeareanly camp romp, the likes of which worked for that universe, but were a far cry from what Mark Webb was famous for with the previous film 500 Days of Summer. Instead, he wanted to focus on the interpersonal relationships of key characters to inform and progress the narrative, with a far more cerebral touch that created, at least for me, a more realistic world to inhabit. Technology is everywhere in this film. Laptops, phones, tablets, earbuds, Bing! These were all conscious decisions made that helped to bring this world more in line with our own, apart from Bing. Compare that to the set from Tobey Maguire's universe and comparatively they look like they're time capsules set in the 60s. However, as many of you might have noticed, one of my main issues with the mask seen in the Sam Raimi trilogy was how often it would mute or stunt the performance of the man beneath the mask. I'm not interested in seeing a mannequin perform an emote. I want to see the emotion translate effectively through the suit to match the scene. And again, as I said in the first Tobey video, one of the main factors preventing these performances from reaching the next level were the face shields. It creates a nice head shape, yes, but it also causes this scene to feel like it's dubbed in the worst way possible.
Don't do it, Goblin!
With the same level of emotion translating in the elevator scene from the second film. And I'm really only picking on Spider-Man in this instance in these films because you can see Dafoe's eyes and mouth most of the time in this movie, and the rest of the villains in these films are either completely CGI or they're not wearing masks at all. So why do I think the approach taken for the Amazing Spider-Man suit works better? Well, 2 reasons. Or should I say, 2 people primarily. Andrew Garfield is a godsend when it comes to physically communicating emotion. He knows that he can't emote with his face, and so he overcompensates through his own physicality. When I revisited these films, Garfield's vocal and physical performances I feel made Tobey's look amateur by comparison. Now, that's not to say Tobey's was bad at all. I don't think that was the case. In fact, I think Tobey walked so that Andrew and Tom could run in this regard. However, in this film, gone are the hands held down by their sides in some static position, and now was a much more dynamic performance that not only communicated personality, but intent and character. In this scene, we get to see Peter Parker's flaws plain as day. This isn't a young man interested in justice and good, but instead someone that's looking to embarrass his targets and get revenge. And due to the efficacy of this performance, Andrew managed to convey the exact results necessary to make the Detective Stacy dinner scene work, and by extension, the entire film work. And while this perspective or opinion on the mask might not be popular or often spoken about online, it's 100% something the actors and stuntmen on these films have had to contend with and try to figure out during their respective runs. David Ellison has been the primary Spider-Man stuntman since 2012. He's appeared donning the mask in both Sony's Amazing Spider-Man and the MCU's incarnation of the character. And in comparing his experience in working with these 2 universes, he specifically outlined Mark Webb's desire for a much more serious and realistic take on the character, remarking that a substantial amount of time and focus had been placed on moving more, quote, spider-like, versus the much more laid-back approach in the original Tobey films, and the greater focus on exaggerated character acting in the MCU incarnation of the character. Each has their pros and cons, however, I truly loved Andrew and David's performance as Spider-Man in these Amazing Spider-Man films. It really served to bring the character to life in a way that helped to alleviate some of the downsides wearing the mask had brought, for me at least, in the past. I really enjoyed Rhys Ifans' Dr. Kirk Connors and his eventual spiral into becoming the Lizard. I thought many of the visuals and much of the dialogue he was given helped to humanize and establish his motivations early on, and despite this section feeling somewhat similar to Norman Osborn's transformation to Green Goblin, I felt as though this rang true to Webb's mission to ground this character in reality. Or as much reality as a giant evil lizard man could possibly grant.
I long to fix myself. I want to create a world without weakness.
Similar to Raimi's approach to tackling these villains, Dr. Connors too expresses his key motivations behind his actions in this film long before he becomes the Lizard, which speaks to this aspect of his personality being present irrespective of the Lizard's influence. However, the scene where this key character moment takes place shares a considerable amount of time and focus with Peter and Gwen, within which Peter's situation and his budding relationship with Gwen Stacy receives much of the focus, and honestly, I'm undecided if that's a good or a bad thing in this instance. Peter's relationship with Gwen isn't just a cornerstone of this one film, but really his entire character across the films he's participated in. It defines him. However, somewhat troublingly, I find myself comparing Dr. Connors' treatment in this film to Osborne's in the first of Raimi's. Osborne, despite not having direct ties to Peter at first, shares the screen with him only 5 minutes into the movie. The two of them receive a tremendous amount of screen time together and separately, with Norman eventually filling the void in Peter's life left behind by his Uncle Ben, leading to that supremely cathartic and emotionally powerful conclusive scene where Peter rejects Norman's way of life in the name of remembering and valuing what his uncle stood for. However, in this film, despite it trying to feel more raw and real, it felt, at least to me, noticeably hollow by comparison. We don't see Kurt until 17 minutes into this film, and when we do, the focus is still on Peter and Gwen, with the main connective tissue and first real conversation between Kurt Connors and Peter coming 30 minutes into the film by way of Peter's parents. Now, I haven't spoken about Peter Parker's parents in this review yet, and that's by design. I think a lot of people have lambasted these films in the past, and in many ways deservedly so. However, I think there's far more positives to these films than the few poor choices that have ultimately and sadly defined these films, which is why I've spent so long singing this film's praises. However, in the interest of balance and, well, honesty, Peter's parents are the single worst inclusion in not just this film, but also the second, unfortunately. With the second film's inclusion, in my opinion, fundamentally destroying everything I love about this Spider-Man character. In this film, they only serve to act as a rather boring motivator enticing Peter to unearth secrets about his past. In other words, they act as a loose motivation to push the plot forward that really the audience, or at least me, did not care about. And most importantly, they don't seem to, in any meaningful way, influence who Peter Parker is nearly as much as his Uncle Ben and Aunt May do in this film. Which would be great if not for how this impacts the Lizard Kurt Connors. As many of you are aware, unlike Norman in the first Raimi film, who played a diametric opposition to Uncle Ben in those movies, Dr. Kurt Connors doesn't have that same thematic connection. His connection to Peter is through the comparatively much less interesting, relatable, and weaker Richard Parker character, whom we don't know anything about. We've not seen him spend any time with his son, and his only line in this film so far has been this.
You good?
And we're supposed to care about this connection to Peter Parker's character because of this. I don't know. With that said, despite my indifferences to Peter's parents in these films, as I mentioned, Dr. Connors does receive a proper character-rich scene about half an hour into this film where he does get to express his regret and history with Peter's father. And in this, he comes across wonderfully well and genuine. A man angry at the prospect of coming so close to achieving his dreams and realizing this anger he felt distracted him from what he should have done for Peter and his family. And so, unlike Norman and befitting of Webb's more realistic vision for this film, Dr. Curtis Connors comes across as a complicated and nuanced character that, while dealing with some questionable anger beneath the surface, harboring resentment for what he has to deal with, he still has a decency to him and an interest in helping Peter where he can. Interestingly, on an aesthetic front, in looking through the behind the scenes for this film, there was a clear passion behind the search for a suitable depiction of the Lizard character also, creating a flatter, rounder head that would allow for more believable communication and speech, while also keeping Reese's eyes to ensure that his humanity would always shine through in his performance. And yet, despite this version of the character having had a tremendous amount of research and care put into it, I've also noticed that much of the discourse surrounding it is criticizing the missing long snout and lab coat that was part of the 90s incarnation of the character. And again, it feels like everyone's modern opinion or vision of Spider-Man seems to come from either the Raimi films or that 90s cartoon. Which is fine if that's your preference, but I think it's also okay to point out that the original run for the Lizard in the Spider-Man comics depicted him as something very close to what we got in this film, flat face and all. Something you might have noticed about this video is that I've spoken very little about Emma Stone and her portrayal of the competent and endearing Gwen Stacy, who plays a surprisingly large and important role in this climax alongside Peter, making her the objective best love interest represented in these live-action films. No, this is not up for debate, and no, I will not be taking questions at this time. But jokes aside, with that said, I do want to give her her own section when discussing The Amazing Spider-Man 2 later on, and all that comes with that. So don't worry, I will be talking about her contribution to these films in due time. I think looking back on my time watching these films as a 20-year-old young adult, one of the final nails in the coffin for me was how flaccid this conclusion to the film felt in comparison to Tobey's films, which always felt like they tried to end on a profound culmination of everything those films had been building up to across their respective runtimes. And while this film does try to do just that, what with a brilliant reveal of his identity to Gwen's father, a callback to the bridge scene where the boy's father helps him reach the Lizard, and of course, a great team-up between Gwen's father and Peter at the end. However, due to issues I alluded to earlier, what with Kurt Connor's frankly perplexing plan to turn the city into lizards, a plan so silly it's only made feel even sillier thanks to the realistic film Webb tried to make, and of course, we have Peter's parents who, as I mentioned, only serve to take weight away from the scene by making Kurt less significant in Peter's life. In addition to all of that, even in some of the cute callbacks like the guy doing Spidey a solid for saving his kid by lifting him on cranes, compare that to the rally that New York had for Peter in the first Tobey film, coincidentally on the bridge too, it just felt lifeless in comparison and it didn't hit the mark in the uplifting way it was aiming for, I think. And really, this was one of the few things I didn't change my opinion on from the first time I watched this versus now. However, with all of that negativity aside, I still have a lot of time for this film and this ending. I felt that while Connor largely didn't work as effectively as he perhaps could have, he did contribute to some memorable scenes and perhaps the most memorable Stan Lee cameo. He offered a tenderness to the role that really added much needed humanity and nuance to the scenes he participated in, and of course, I'm a big fan of the design. With all of that said, however, Captain Stacy is still the man who steals this film. He's a rock of a character that breathes so much stoicism and grit into the script, elevating already great scenes to something far more than the sum of their parts. His confrontation with Peter once he learns his identity is powerful, and his request of Peter to stay out of Gwen's life is both wise and informs the next film tremendously. Outside of the main role of Peter Parker, he's the single most important character in this film, and he absolutely hits it out of the park, hammering home a profound message to all of those watching, as well as Peter Parker at this film's closing moments. One that I'm sure he now wishes he had heeded in retrospect. While this film has its flaws, many of which I touched on here, I still think this take on the Spider-Man story had a lot to say, a lot of interesting things to say. When I first saw this in theaters at 20 years of age, I was in the middle of failing my second year of college, after having to repeat my first year already. I didn't feel like I had a promising future, and in addition to that, when I went to see this film, I did so not with my brothers and family like I had done with the Sam Raimi films, but instead with my friends, my peers. During that time, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and everyone around me seemed to either be doing extremely well or already after graduating. And looking back on my frame of mind now while watching this film, I was in a very negative place, and in many respects, unjustifiably wanted this film not to be its own thing, but to instead provide me with the exact same experience I had when I was at a happier point in my life. In other words, I think I was living in the past, demanding of this film an experience I already had with Raimi, and one that it had no intention of trying to replicate. And so, while I can't say this film is perfect and does in fact have a lot of flaws, I'm also not a struggling 20-year-old kid that's scared of his future anymore. I can see and appreciate the filmmaking and dedication for this character that both Mark Webb and Andrew Garfield so lovingly adapted into a fresh coming-of-age tale that I, in actuality, had I been in the right frame of mind to receive its message, would have been the perfect story for me to learn from as a young adult. And still, to this day, has a lot to offer. It's a great movie and much better than so many people give it credit for. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I really like this movie. I think there are a lot of brilliant things in this movie. I will spend most of my time talking about this movie exploring its criminally underrated positives, but I came across something that so perfectly highlights one of the main issues with these films so succinctly that I absolutely had to share it with you all right off the bat because I thought it was hilarious. So, one of the most viewed videos concerning The Amazing Spider-Man 2 on YouTube is this one uploaded by IGN. Say what you want about IGN, but in the eyes of big corporations like Sony, they are an important part of their marketing for their films online. And the video they uploaded was called The Amazing Spider-Man 2, The First 10 Minutes. With wonderful comments like this from Frostbitey10, quote, "This is the best opening to a Spider-Man movie, hands down." And you know what? I'd be inclined to agree. Contained within this reintroduction to Spider-Man is his brand new amazing looking suit. We get the introduction to Electro, the main villain of this story, all the while Spidey tries to stop Paul Giamatti's Rhino in his tracks during a period of time he's supposed to be at his graduation. Which, as an opener, besides having all the benefits and trappings of a perfect introduction to some characters we'll see later, it also sets up a really emotional and profound speech to hit Peter with at the end of the film following the horrific tragedy that follows, bookending the narrative nicely. I love this opening sequence. It's stunningly choreographed, funnier than the previous film in a very Spider-Man sort of way, hits some important character beats, and introduces us to, once again, the main antagonist, ending on an exchange between Aunt May and Peter that seems like a harmless interaction at first, but in fact speaks to the heart of this film.
Follow the path, make your own trail.
It's a brilliant opener and totally deserving of every single one of those 207 million views it boasts. If not for one teeny tiny problem. Those aren't the first 10 minutes of the film. These are.
That's a pretty up thing to say to me.
Catching up with everyone's favorite characters from these films, Richard and Mary Parker, as their backstory continues, boasting sequences of scenes and set pieces more closely related to the Jason Bourne or James Bond franchises. We watch as these two continue their story from the first film as they do secret agent file uploads on a laptop about a mile in the sky. Now, with that said, while this doesn't feel at all like a Spider-Man film yet, I don't want to gatekeep any artist's desire to explore what Spider-Man might mean to them. However, this scene doesn't feel like the rest of the film either, and so I wonder if IGN and Sony wished that this was the first 10 minutes of the film and that this spy stuff wasn't, or if it sincerely was just an accident. Either way, IGN, that is false advertising. I'm holding you accountable. And you know what? This would be fine if it didn't connect intrinsically to this film, but much like the last one, it does. And unfortunately, it's in the worst way possible in this film specifically. I won't harp on about this too much, but the fact that Peter turns out not to be an everyman, but in fact the son of a secret scientific spy father that created the spiders that bit him in the first place, and that the only reason he was able to become Spider-Man was because of his blood. All of that is to say that it really takes from what I see as the main value of this character, that anyone could wear the mask. It's what makes it so powerful. And it's a shame because I actually liked this movie more than the first one, and by a wide margin. Which I did not expect because this is the movie people have been clowning on for years and years. Many have considered this film to be the worst Spider-Man film. It didn't do well enough in theaters to justify a third film, and to be completely clear, this film has more flaws than the first film, so how is it possible that I liked it more?
Hey, I'm sorry, I'm running a bit late. I got stuck in some traffic.
Gwen and Peter's relationship in these films is something I really don't think I fully appreciated when I first watched them back in the mid-2010s. And even looking back now, I feel like a lot of people still sleep on this dynamic. I look at Mary Jane and Peter from the original films and think, yes, I think they work well together, but I wasn't ever really invested in a meaningful way. It was always sort of set dressing. And it wasn't just them. Looking ahead with MJ in the MCU with Holland's Peter, I liked their relationship and find it very believable. However, Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker's relationship in these films would be enough to carry the film even if you were to take out the Spider-Man aspect of it. If this wasn't a Spider-Man flick, this dynamic still works, and I think that's when you truly know you have something special on your hands here. Obviously, Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone are two incredibly charismatic and talented performers, and their dynamic came across as beautifully authentic thanks in no small part to them dating during the filming of these films. However, upon revisiting the movies of Tobey, Andrew, and eventually Tom Holland next week, I sat down with my partner who hadn't seen most of these films and none of the Andrew Garfield ones. And you know what? These Andrew Garfield films turned out to be her absolute favorites. And she thinks that because of the two lead characters' dynamic and rapport, they make these movies feel like they have weight and they have consequences. The way they look at each other, the way they walk, talk, and make decisions with one another. It all feels so intoxicatingly genuine and elevates this film far above what it otherwise would be without it, I think. And while I know for some their relationship might have been a bit too cute or meandering at times from a dialogue perspective, I genuinely believe that their relationship is the cornerstone of this film, and indeed the first one too. One that without these films just wouldn't work. And the reason why this dynamic is so perfect is because it asks a vital and intense question about responsibility. Should she know? This film is better than the first film. And while I know a lot of people don't like Electro and Harry Osborn in this film, I thought they delivered and executed upon its themes exceptionally well, in a much more sophisticated way than I recalled, and I think more than any other critic has been able to give credit for. But how, I hear you asking? Well, allow me to explain what I've noticed. Electro, or Max Dillon, is an unassuming and deeply troubled man that becomes endowed with tremendous electrical abilities. He shares a number of scenes with Spider-Man both before and after becoming Electro, with each subsequent encounter becoming more and more violent. This is a character whose entire being is defined by Spider-Man because he has nothing else. He doesn't see himself as worth anything. Initially enamored by him and showing deep appreciation for him, eventually Electro comes to despise Spider-Man and what he believes he stands for. Now, Harry Osborn, on the other hand, not many people liked him in this film. He looks weird at the end, and his relationship with Peter seems dubious at best, considering he wasn't mentioned at all in the first film. And having just come off the back of 3 films where James Franco helped us get to know the character of Harry Osborn, for this version of Harry to randomly show up out of nowhere and expect us to believe he's Peter's best friend is a tall ask. However, I think what he offers this film is still brilliant. Harry represents Peter's past and present. He's a direct relationship Peter has that's disconnected from his role as Spider-Man. Having grown up with Peter as we see towards the beginning of this film, we come to learn that he has a deep appreciation for Peter. However, much like Max Dillon did with Spider-Man, over the course of this film, Harry feels slighted and let down by Peter in the moments where he feels like he needed him the most. He feels betrayed by Peter, leading to this scene.
Please! I know what it's like to be thrown away. Please, Max! I need you! I need you!
This entire film is about Peter Parker and Spider-Man making the right choices now that he has chosen to take the responsibility as both Spider-Man and Peter Parker. People depend on him, and bad things would happen if he was to make the wrong choices. And very early on in the film, Peter exercises one of those choices by breaking up with Gwen Stacy. In his mind, trying to do the right thing, trying to do right by her father. However, during the runtime of this film, we see him struggle to keep the promises he's made and to stick to the decisions he's committed himself to. He keeps trying to see Gwen, gets back with her, doesn't stop looking for his parents, and as a result causes his Aunt May to feel inadequate. He's trying to have this life both ways. He's trying to have all the pros of Spider-Man, which this movie goes to tremendous lengths to glorify, all the while he also tries to have everything he wants as Peter Parker. In short, he wants it both ways. And this aspect of the film comes to its romantic height in this moment, where Peter, in an effort to reconnect with Gwen before she moves away forever, sends her a message.
You're wrong about us being on different paths. We're not on different paths. You're my path.
This exact exchange with Gwen mirrors perfectly the advice Aunt May gave to Peter at the beginning of this film right after he graduated. Using Uncle Ben's words, she encouraged Peter to blaze his own trail. However, this advice, while perfectly innocent, his naive interpretation of said advice leads Peter onto making the worst decision of his young life.
You can't be here right now. I'm not messing around. You can't be here right now. This is insane.
The ending of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 does not pull its punches. This film has been asking what the ramifications of not truly respecting and understanding the responsibility you have might be, and boy, does it work in that regard. Max Dillon, someone that felt betrayed by Spider-Man, Harry Osborne, someone that felt betrayed by both Peter and Spider-Man, joined forces as a wonderful thematic illustration of Peter's failings in trying to find balance in his life. Gwen is the goal. She always has been. And in his haste to have everything he's ever wanted, unfortunately, once Gwen gets wrapped up in this danger, Dillon and Osborne both act as the sobering reality check Peter created for himself by confiding in and wishing to be with Gwen in the first place, concluding with everything being torn away from him. To me, Gwen Stacy in these films is by far the best of every love interest depicted in any Spider-Man related film. On top of feeling like a real character, she brought a competence and warmth to every scene she was a part of. In being who she was, she fundamentally helped Peter become the man he is today, even saving him and working with him to solve complex problems with life and death in the balance. She was brave, she was loving, and she was his path. I think the part of this film that has stuck with me the longest is the question it asks at the very end. Throughout these two films, there have been questions asked of both Peter and us, the audience. However, throughout this film, it broadly concerned itself with one question. Can Peter find balance in his life? And he couldn't. He failed. The hero failed to protect and uphold what was most important to him, and so part of him now dies as a result. How can he go on? How can he live with himself? This is the best question asked in the film, and personally, I found its answer not only profound, but invaluable as an outlook towards an uncertain and scary future. There will be dark days ahead of us too. There will be days where you feel all alone, and that's when hope is needed most. No matter how buried it gets or how lost you feel, you must promise that you will hold on to hope. Keep it alive. We have to be greater than what we suffer. My wish for you is to become hope. People need that. And even if we fail,
Hey, Spider-Man.
what better way is there to live? Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, I think, is the single most relatable Spider-Man out of the main three. Dealing with some of the most harrowing of circumstances while still managing to find the strength to greet another day with courage. As an actor, Andrew, to me, is the single best ever to don the mask. He's proven himself not only to hold this character near and dear to his heart for his entire life, he's not only given us lasting and beautiful performances, but he also, for those projects, took less pay than both Tom and Tobey by considerable margins. For his first two films, Tom Holland was paid over $5 million. For Tobey's first two films, he was paid north of $20 million. For Andrew, he was paid $1.5. And given the scope of his performances in these films, as well as what they grossed, in addition to his dedication to the Spider-Man franchise, I at the very least wanted to give these films the praise I thought they deserved. I genuinely believe that enough people have criticized these films. They're not perfect, and I think we all know that. But consider this just another one of the small voices out there that say this, while flawed, is still an amazing Spider-Man franchise.